Let's keep reading Kenny and the Dragon. We're up to chapter 5. The least bit worried. Kenny stared at the newspaper in disbelief. The town had found out about Grahame, and they wanted him exterminated. What was Kenny going to do now? What if it ransacks our harvest? It would be devastating, an old farmer moaned. If that thing burns my crops, I'll get my revenge for sure, another sneered, clenching his fists. We could get a posse together and take him out. Who's with me? Well, where is it? Someone else shouted. The paperboy pointed to Kenny and said, Ask him. It's living on his hill, and he told our whole class about how he knew the dragon firsthand. A hush fell over the group as they turned to look at the boy. A weird riverstone in the stomach feeling hit Kenny hard, and the lad hopped on his bicycle and pedalled away as fast as he could. Kenny skidded to a stop in front of George's store. The Borough bookshop was located on a quiet street with little storefronts lining both sides. Fortunately, it looked like no one else from the gathering had followed him there. A little bell tinkled as Kenny pushed the door open and slipped into the shop. As the oak door swung closed, he peered through the window one last time to see if he was being trailed, but there was no one to be seen on the cobblestone street outside. As he exhaled and caught his breath, the familiar mixed scent of wood, old leather-bound books, and hot tea greeted him, and he made his way through the dusty labyrinth of dimly lit bookshelves and armchairs. He approached the sales desk, which was cluttered with stacks of books, and peered over the countertop. Charlotte, George's young shop assistant, poked her head out from the little office behind the counter. She was a bit older than Kenny and quite popular around town. Her parents were tailors and lived right next door. She had been helping out at the shop for as long as Kenny could remember. "Hey, Kenny, we haven't seen you in a while. How you doing?" "Hi, Charlotte. I'm okay, I guess." He plopped the borrowed books down onto the counter. "Have you seen George?" Lately, for some reason, Kenny felt a bit shy when he was around Charlotte. In fact, it was hard for him to look at her directly. She had such big, bright, sparkly eyes that he glanced at her just briefly, then had to look down at his feet. "If you can believe it, he's actually gone out," she said with a chuckle. "He had to go down to the post office to sign for some mail. I think it might have been some official royal thingy from the palace." "Huh?" Kenny had heard stories of George's past exploits during his service as a cavalier. For some reason, he couldn't picture his old friend doing the things he often recounted in his tales. He sometimes suspected that they were half fabricated from all the books the codger had read. But George was the smartest fellow in town as far as Kenny was concerned. If anyone would have answers on how best to handle the Grahame situation, it would be him. Now, on the one day the boy needed him most, he was out. "Hey, did you see the paper today? A dragon, a real live dragon spotted near here. It's unbelievable," Charlotte said as she took the books and sauntered down an aisle. "I heard old Pop's possum saw it drinking from Parish Creek." "Great," Kenny thought to himself. "Now everybody knows where Grahame is. It's just a matter of time before someone else spots him, probably frolicking about on the hilltop. What is taking George so long?" He hopped along, following Charlotte into the natural history section of the store. "Yeah, I know, crazy. Hey, can you let George know I'll stop back by tomorrow?" "Are you sure you don't want to just hang out and wait?" "He'll probably be back soon, and I know he's been dying to see you," she said, as she put the bestiary back on the shelf. "No," he replied, as he glanced at the book. "I got some stuff I need to take care of." "Okay, you know the shop will be closed tomorrow, but he'll be home," Charlotte said, then stopped arranging the books. "Hey, Kenny, Is everything all right?" "I'm okay," he replied. "I just got a lot on my mind. With a wild monster on the loose, I can understand. But hey, don't worry. The lass, the lass said with a smile and those big sparkly eyes, "I'm sure everything is going to be just fine." Heading back up the hill, the boy found the dragon with a wreath on his head, reciting lines to a captive audience consisting of Kenny's parents and their flock of sheep, who had by now gotten used to Grahame's presence. "Not for thy fairy kingdom, fairies, away! We shall chide downright if I longer stay." With this declaration, the dragon ran around the hilltop, causing the sheep to scatter in all directions. He stopped when he noticed Kenny walking his bike towards them. "Hey there, Bantling, you're just in time. You can play Oberon," he said with a toothy grin. "Hello," Kenny replied. He leaned his bike against the trunk of the large weeping willow and trudged over to his parents. He flopped down on the blanket next to them and upset a glass of lemonade. "What is it, Kenneth? What's wrong?" His mum wiped his face with the bottom of her apron. He pulled away from her and reached into his satchel. "This," he answered, and stood up, handing the newspaper to Grahame. "What is it, Kit?" his father asked. "What's it say?" "It says," Grahame read aloud, scanning the article, "that I am to be exterminated." Kenny's parents exchanged glances. "Look here, the daft scribe misspelled imminent. Ha!" He continued reading the paper, flipping through the pages. "Ooh, look here, word puzzles." "What? Aren't you the least bit worried?" asked Kenny. "Not at all. There will be no exterminations, imminent or otherwise," Grahame replied with a wink. "Now come on, we're getting to the good part of the play. I'm not feeling very theatrical today. Can I just watch?" "Sure, but I expect a bouquet at the end for my grand performance," the dragon said with a smile. Kenny sat with his parents and continued watching Grahame. The drake carried on, seemingly oblivious to the ruckus that was brewing in town. Kenny's dad quietly relaxed, sipping some lemonade while his mum knit a pot holder. And even though the boy appeared calm, that river stone stomach feeling had not gone away. Chapter 6. Kerfuffle down in Riverbrook. Like a bulldozer, Kenny shoved his toys and books under his bed. His mum had told him to clean up his room and drop off his dirty clothes before leaving for the day. The boy ran to the laundry room, leaving a trail of shirts and socks, and dumped his clothes in the hamper. All he could think about was speaking to George about Grahame. Just after breakfast, Kenny found himself back in the centre of town. This time, however, it seemed like there were even more people milling about, and certainly quite a few who were not local. It was difficult for the boy to even navigate his bicycle down the street, so he hopped off and walked through the throng, worried about what had brought them all out. It didn't take long for him to find that his suspicions were correct. There, on the corner of Main Street, old Pop's Possum was describing his encounter with Grahame. "It was as big as that building," he said, pointing to the Riverbrook Inn. The crowd oohed. "With glowing, fiendish eyes and teeth like blood-dripping daggers. I am sure it had killed and was washing the gory evidence away. I barely escaped with my life," he continued. The crowd ahed. Kenny bent his head low as he passed so that no one, especially old Pops, would see him. "This can't be happening," he muttered to himself. He turned the corner and ran smack dab into a band of roving minstrels, singing tales of terrible dragons, gallant knights, and beautiful maidens. As they moved gracefully past him, they were followed by a large pack of children with wooden play swords battling with each other, yelling, "I slay you, dragon! I slay you!" Watching in total shock as the kids ran down the street, Kenny bumped into a vendor pushing a large cart. "Dragon-embroidered tunics and tees," the stout fellow yelled. "Get your official shirts with the Riverbrook dragon on it." He paused for a moment and looked down at Kenny. "You look like a small," he said, and dropped a shirt into the boy's hands. It was emblazoned with a cartoonish, goofy drake blasting orange fire. Kenny's eyes went wide. He threw the shirt to the ground and got back on his bike. He was in such a rush, he almost ran over the little girl biting the head off a dragon-shaped cookie. Regaining his composure, he found his way to the quiet alley where George's shop was. He slid off his bicycle and pounded on the heavy wooden door. The sign in the smudged window read, "Closed on Sunday." An elderly gentleman badger, older than his father, answered. He had grey hair and a white beard and moustache, and he spoke in a gravelly yet spirited voice. "Kenny, my lad, my squire, so very good to see you. Come in, he said, as he welcomed the boy into the shop, locking the door behind him. They walked behind the counter, through the office, up the stairs and into his little home on the second floor. "Charlotte mentioned you had stopped by. Can I get you a drink? Birch beer, perhaps?" Sure, Kenny replied as he sat down in a sturdy seat next to their ongoing chess game. The old fellow had taught the boy chess years ago, and from that day on there was always a game going. Because, George had once told him, in life you must always plan your moves. Think before you act, move toward a favourable outcome. Right now, Kenny couldn't think of chess strategies at all, or any sort of favourable outcome for Grahame, based on what he'd just seen in town. He glanced around the cluttered, dusty room. An antique clock ticked in the corner beneath a faded tapestry hanging on the wall. A large chest with a huge padlock was sitting in the opposite corner. Kenny didn't recall having seen it before, but there were so many books stacked on every available surface that it had likely been buried during his past visits. George walked in and sat down with 2 frothy mugs. "Here you go, son, drink up. It's your turn, you know," the old fellow said as he gestured toward the game. "So sorry I missed you yesterday. I was beginning to wonder if you'd forgotten me. It certainly has been a while, and I've so much to tell you." "Me too," Kenny replied, and took a sip of his birch beer. "Oh, I'm glad that you returned the books you'd borrowed. I sold all our copies of the King's Royal Bestiary last night and had to order more. It seems like everyone is a frenzy over this dragon sighting, but I can tell you it will be all over quite soon." At this statement, Kenny's river-stone stomach returned, but he had to remain calm and carefully explain to the old-timer about Grahame. If anyone could help his friend out of this mess, it would be George. He made his move on the chessboard. Rook takes pawn. "Bold move," the codger exclaimed, and moved his knight forward. "So there's this exciting news I want to tell you about." "Can I tell you first? Rook takes bishop." "Of course, lad, spit it out." Kenny took a sip from his mug. "I made a new friend." "A new friend, you say? From school? Have you been playing chess with him?" George chuckled. "Because you're certainly giving me quite a wallop on the battlefield today." "Not from school, actually, no. He's new in town, and I really want to introduce you to him. I think you guys will really get along." "A friend of yours is a friend of mine. By all means, bring the lad by. In fact..." There was a knock at the door. With a hold that thought gesture, George ran downstairs and answered it. Kenny couldn't see much from where he was sitting, but it sounded like someone was delivering a package. "A friend of yours is a friend of mine," he said to his mug, and smiled. Perhaps this wasn't going to be so difficult after all. The stomach began to fade, and he heard a hearty "Thank you, sir," from downstairs right before the door slammed shut. George returned to his study holding a large, ornately sealed scroll. He was smiling from ear to ear. He sat down on the trunk with a large padlock. "What?" Kenny said. "What is it?" Yesterday I received word from the Royal Palace requesting me to come out of retirement," George said, pointing to some letters on his desk. So it was true. The old-timer really had worked for the king after all. His stories of life as a cavalier and armoured horseman were real. "And today," George said as he held up the scroll, "I received my official orders for one final task. It is a most honourable task, I might add." "Orders?" Kenny asked. But the answer was slowly dawning on him. He glanced down at the trunk with a padlock on a small rusty brass plate. It read, "From His Majesty's Royal Armoury, property of George E. Badger." King orders armour. George was a knight. The old gent stood gallantly, opened the scroll, cleared his throat, and read, "My dear George, it has been ages since we last spoke. I do hope this letter finds you still in the best of health and your little shop thriving. The court has never quite been the same since you retired. If I may be so bold as to get right to the point, I would ask one last request requiring your special skills for our great land. It seems there is a bit of a kerfuffle down in Riverbrook and that only you can resolve. I do hope you're up for it, as there is no one else in all our land who can handle this as well and as as professionally as you. You're such a saint for doing this. As always, I remain your faithful friend and ruler, the King. P.S. Don't let me down. I bet 4-1 you'll be triumphant. P.P.S. Can you send over a copy of the bestiary? I seem to have misplaced mine." George stood with his hands on his hips, clearly invigorated by the letter. "Well, what do you think of that?" The river stone had expanded beyond Kenny's stomach. He could feel it pressing into his throat. He knew what George was going to say, but he had to ask. He needed to know for sure. "What is it that he is asking you to do?" The knight opened the trunk, revealing a complete suit of armour. It was elaborately engraved, yet tarnished in spots. "My dear boy," he said, pulling out a long gleaming sword, "I am his devil dispatcher, his scourge remover. I am the kingdom's #1 dragon slayer."